Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're stepping into one of the hardest moments in this story, when love is tested by sacrifice. What happens when she chooses to leave to protect him, but he refuses to let her go? Will they walk away from each other, or finally face everything together? Stay with me to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The decision didn't explode. It didn't create a scene. It didn't need to. It moved quietly, from one person to another, until it reached the one person who had never expected it. The CEO's father. When the news came, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no argument, just a message, short, clear. The wedding will continue. That was all. But for a man who had spent his entire life building control, order, and reputation, those 5 words were enough. By the time the CEO arrived at the hospital, the hallway was already filled with a strange kind of silence. Not chaotic, not loud, but tense. His mother stood outside the room, perfect as always, but her eyes were colder than before. "You came," she said. The CEO didn't respond. "What happened?" he asked. His mother looked at him for a long moment. "You happened," she replied. The words were quiet, but they didn't need volume. "He collapsed after reading your message," she continued. "The doctor says it's stress." A pause. "He's asking for you." The CEO's chest tightened. For a moment, everything else faded. The wedding, the decision, the fight, all of it disappeared. Because behind that door was the man who had raised him. He stepped inside. The room was dim, quiet, machines humming softly. His father lay there, still. Not weak, but not the same either. For the first time, the CEO hesitated. "Sit," his father said, his voice weaker, but still controlled. The CEO pulled a chair closer, sat down. A long silence followed. Then, his father spoke. "You chose her." Not a question. The CEO nodded. "Yes." Another silence. "You didn't even try to compromise," his father said. "I did," the CEO replied quietly, "but not at the cost you wanted." His father closed his eyes briefly. "You think this is just about me," he said, "but it's not." The CEO didn't interrupt. "This family, everything you have, everything you are," his father continued slowly, "didn't come from nowhere." A pause. "And now you're ready to walk away from it." The CEO leaned forward slightly. "I'm not walking away," he said. "I'm choosing differently." His father opened his eyes again, looked at him. Long. "And if that choice costs you everything?" he asked. The CEO didn't answer immediately, because now, that question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. "I've already thought about that," he said finally. "And you're still willing?" his father pressed. A pause, then, "Yes." The room fell silent, because that answer couldn't be taken back. His father turned his head slightly, looking away. "Then you're not the son I raised," he said quietly. The words landed harder than anything before, but the CEO didn't react. Not outwardly, because deep down, he understood. This wasn't rejection, this was loss. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, another decision was forming. Tio Lac sat on the floor, her daughter asleep beside her. The room was quiet, but her thoughts were not. She had heard everything, the hospital, the collapse, the reason, and suddenly, everything felt heavier. "Me," she whispered to herself, because she knew this feeling, the feeling of being the reason something broke. When the door opened that evening, she didn't run to greet him, she didn't ask questions, she just looked at him, and in that one look, she understood everything. "He's okay?" she asked. The CEO nodded. "He's stable." A pause, but neither of them said what mattered. Not yet. Tio Lac stood up slowly. "I think," she began, then stopped. The CEO watched her. "I think I should go back," she said finally. Silence. "What?" he asked. "Back to the village," she repeated. The words felt unreal, even as she said them. "Why?" His voice lowered slightly. Tio Lac took a breath. "Because this is too much," she said. A pause. "For you." The CEO shook his head immediately. "No." But she continued. "You shouldn't have to choose like this," she said, "between me and your father." "I already did," he replied, but this time her eyes didn't soften. "That's the problem," she said quietly. Silence. "I don't want to be the reason your family breaks," she added. Her voice didn't shake, because this wasn't fear, it was clarity. The CEO stepped closer. "You're not the reason," he said firmly. "But I'm part of it," she replied. And that he couldn't deny. The baby stirred slightly, let out a small sound. Both of them looked down. For a moment, everything else disappeared again. Just them and her. "I can't watch you lose everything," Tio Lac said softly. "And I can't watch you leave," the CEO replied. The words met and stayed, because neither of them was willing to step back, and yet both of them knew something had to give. That night, no one slept. Not really. Because for the first time, the choice wasn't just his anymore, it was hers too. And somewhere, between love and sacrifice, a decision was coming, one that neither of them was ready to make. The night didn't end with a decision, it stretched, quietly, painfully, into the early hours of the morning. The apartment was still, too still. The baby slept between them, unaware of everything unfolding around her. But neither Tio Lac nor the CEO closed their eyes. Not really, because every time they did, the same question returned. Stay or leave? When the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, Tio Lac was already awake. She hadn't slept, not even for a moment. She moved carefully, quietly getting out of bed so she wouldn't wake the baby. Her steps were soft, deliberate, because deep down, she had already decided. The suitcase sat in the corner, still half empty. She walked toward it slowly, then stopped. For a moment, her hands didn't move, because this wasn't just packing, this was leaving. She knelt down, opened it, and began folding clothes, one by one, each piece, a memory, a moment, a part of something she had just started to build. Behind her, a voice. "You're really doing this?" She froze. The CEO stood there, watching, not angry, not loud, just present. Tio Lac didn't turn immediately. "I told you last night," she said softly. "That wasn't an answer," he replied. Silence. She slowly stood up, turned to face him. "It is now." The words were gentle, but firm. The CEO took a step forward. "You think leaving will fix this?" he asked. "No," she said. A pause. "But it will stop it from getting worse." The room fell quiet again. "You don't know that," he said. "I do," she replied. Another step closer. "If I stay, you lose your father," she continued. "If I leave, you don't." Simple, clear, cruel. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice lower now. "Then how does it work?" she asked. The question hung between them, because neither of them had the answer. The baby stirred, let out a soft cry. Tio Lac turned immediately, lifting her into her arms, holding her close. The CEO watched them, his eyes softer now, but heavier. "This is your family too," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know." "Then don't walk away from it," he added. Tio Lac shook her head slowly. "I'm not walking away," she said. A pause. "I'm stepping back." The difference was small, but it meant everything. "So you want me to stay here," he said, "while you go back there, like none of this happened?" Her eyes filled slightly. "No," she whispered, "I want you to stay and not regret it." Silence, because that was something he couldn't promise. The CEO ran a hand through his hair, turning away for a moment. Everything inside him pulled in two directions. His father lying in a hospital bed, waiting. His daughter in front of him, needing him. And her, standing there, trying to leave before he had to choose. "I didn't ask you to sacrifice yourself," he said suddenly. "You didn't have to," she replied. Another silence. Then he stepped forward again. This time, closer. "You think I can just let you go?" he asked. Tio Lac looked at him. "I think you have to," she said. The words landed harder than anything else. The baby reached out, her tiny hand brushing against his sleeve. Without thinking, he took her hand, held it. For a moment, everything stopped again, because this was real, not decisions, not pressure, just them. "I chose you," he said quietly. Tio Lac's eyes closed briefly. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm choosing you too," she added. A pause. "That's why I'm leaving." The contradiction, perfect, painful. The CEO let out a slow breath. Then, he did something unexpected. He reached down, closed the suitcase. Firm, final. "No." Tio Lac looked at him. "You don't get to decide this alone," he said. Silence. "If you leave," he continued, "then it's not a choice anymore." A pause. "It's just running." Her expression shifted, not anger, not hurt, but something deeper. Truth. "And if I stay?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Then we face it." The words were simple, but this time they didn't feel impossible. "Together?" she asked. He nodded. "Together." A long silence followed. Not heavy, not tense, just still. Because for the first time, neither of them was trying to protect the other. By stepping away, they were staying, even if it hurt, even if it cost everything. Later that day, the CEO stood outside the hospital again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Tio Lac stood beside him, their daughter in her arms. She didn't speak, but she didn't leave either. The CEO looked at her, then at the door in front of them. And for the first time, the choice didn't feel like something he had to make alone. He reached for her hand, held it tightly. Then, they walked in, because whatever came next, they would face it. Not as two people choosing between love and family, but as one family refusing to break. In this episode, the tension reaches a breaking point as Tio Lac decides to leave, believing it's the only way to protect the CEO from losing his family. While his father lies in the hospital after the shock, the CEO is forced into an impossible choice between love and filial duty. As Tio Lac quietly packs to return to her hometown, hoping to end the conflict, the CEO refuses to accept her decision. Instead of letting her go, he insists they face everything together. In a powerful turning moment, he closes the suitcase and chooses not to lose her again. Together with their daughter, they decide to confront the situation side by side. Now the question remains, can their unity withstand the pressure, or will reality still tear them apart?